Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of the Globe and Grind podcast. My name is Abhijit and I'm your host. With us, we have a very special guest who is revolutionizing how solo travel is happening in the Indian ecosystem. As a whole, I had the pleasure of speaking with Rishab actually through a LinkedIn post where we got connected, and it was an instant connection as to what he was working on and what Hostelmatch does as well. So I thought it would be a really cool opportunity to get him on the podcast, talk to us through how the Indian market works when you look at travel as a whole, specifically the solo travel side of it, how stigmas around solo travel have significantly changed. He's also going to talk a little bit more about how Polarturn is very well suited for the Indian demographic. So thank you so much, Rishab, for being on the podcast, and we're really happy to have you on it.
Thanks a ton for having me here, Abhijit. This is for the first time I'm gonna officially and on recording talking about my experiences. So means a lot. And of course, you guys are doing all the great job with Hostelmatch and to sort of align and share what we are eventually trying to do with Polarturn and how I have traveled and what all my journey has been so far would be super interesting. And of course, would love to know some bits from you as well. But yeah, let's
For sure, for sure. Happy to
happy
jump
to start.
into it. But so you mentioned like you've traveled a little bit. Both of us have companies in the travel space. So wanted to learn a little bit more about how the excitement for travel came about in yourself. Was it mostly like solo trips? Did you enjoy going with friends? Like, what was the vibe like when you were actually going and traveling around in all these different places?
So I think the first time I traveled solo was back in 2017 when I just moved to Delhi for the first time for my undergrad.
Right,
And back then it was the time wherein I had no clue what solo traveling was. One of my friends said that somebody was sort of going out on a solo trip and it sounded too fancy for a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old like me that
right.
I want to do this. So how it all started was I called my parents and I was like, I'm going to Rishikesh for 2 days all by myself. And they apparently my dad thought that I was sick. I was homesick, and that's why I'm making such redundant decisions of going out on a first solo trip or something. Like he didn't knew something like this existed until I introduced him to this word. And honestly, even I was hearing it for the first time. So he sort of made me realize that hey, if you're feeling sick or if you're sort of running out of money, let me send some money to you because maybe you have moved out for the first time. That is why you're like actually ill or something. So that is how it all got started, and they actually convinced me that I was sick, and I sat down back in my hostel for like good 2 weeks, and that is when I actually sort of thought that no, I really want to go there, and I then called my dad, and I was like, no, I'm going this time around. I'm not telling you that I'm going out on a first solo trip,
Right.
and it was horrible. So I took that first step and I went to Rishikesh for the first time. This was me staying in a hostel for the first time. I still remember the name of that property. It was called the bunk stays in Rishikesh near Lakshman Jhula, and I was so overwhelmed by the fact that I was like in my own world. I was super cool, trying to be amongst my peers. I was the coolest one out there because I had gone out for something like a solo trip. But then it
Right.
comes out there are people who are so seasoned. They've seen the world. They've been to multiple countries. They've been staying in that place for months now, and I was like, fuck, what the hell? I was here to look cool, but it's not happening for me. I mean, so I got super overwhelmed, and with that, I mean, I just wrapped up 2 most difficult days of my life back in Rishikesh. Got back to home, didn't really talk about that trip in front of my parents, in front of my friends,
Right.
because in their world I was doing a great thing, but it turns out it wasn't that great for me. It was honestly super bad. I didn't know what to do sitting back in that hostel super quietly and see a bunch of like foreign people hanging around, smoking up and doing whatnot. So yeah, that was my first experience. And then when I actually introspected, I realized that no, it was something that I was looking for, and I want to try it once again. So I
Right.
again went to Rishikesh to yeah, yeah. So I again went to Rishikesh for a time being and spent like some more time there. Spent 4 days just traveling solo, and that is how I got started. So yeah, I mean, long story short, it's been close to 7 years now. I've done close to, I don't know, can't even count it, close to 200 plus solo trips all by myself. I've done close to 20, 25 plus states within India and close to 10 countries around the world. So, and it has all been great. So, there is this one harsh reality that I've been able to accept that it's not going to be super nice when you travel around solo. It comes with a lot of hardships. It does come with a lot of loneliness at times, no matter how social you end up being, but you still feel that sense of hollowness that, okay, I mean, where are my people around? So, I mean, I think that is the transition I've been able to get starting from the first day when I went to Rishikesh. And I mean, today is the date wherein I don't feel any sense of overwhelmingness or whatever you want to call it when it comes to traveling. I mean, that is my go-to now.
No, that completely makes sense, and it resonates with me so much because similar to yourself, like growing up in India, solo travel wasn't really a thing. Like if you went solo traveling, people thought like you needed some help. And as you mentioned, right, like initially that step that you took, like it's not a step that a lot of people take. So back in 2017, when you
Right.
took that step, like when you kind of ventured into solo travel, what was the vibe like? What you mentioned, like there were a lot of foreigners there. So was it mostly a place where only foreigners like to solo travel and the Indian market wasn't really getting into it, or was it still like a little bit mix of both?
I think back in time, people were not really experimenting with solo travel. I mean, there were just a bunch of handful people who were, let's say, solo traveling. If I talk about the Indian travelers, so this guy, I still remember. I mean, I literally cried the other day because he played a prank on me in my hostel. He was like, "I'm from XYZ, I don't know, country, and I want to do this to you, this and that to you." So it turns out that back in time, there were not a lot of people experimenting to solo travel as to what something that I did. But right now the landscape has sort of changed, wherein I see more and more people trying to give a shot to solo travel. And back in time, I think it was mostly people from the west who were like majorly whom I could find back in my hostel specifically. I mean, if I try to recall from my first solo trip, so it was a bunch of Europeans. I mean, that is what I always bump into. I don't see a lot of Americans traveling around as exhaustively as people back from Europe. So it was majorly people back from Europe, and not a lot of Indians around. Of course, a lot of young crowd was there, but they were majorly traveling in groups, like with friends or with their partners and something like that.
No, that completely makes sense. And one of the things that caught my attention was you said you've traveled to almost 20 or 25 states in India. And for people who are not from India, India has like 29 states right now. So that's majority
Correct.
of the states that you've kind of traveled to. And when you're thinking about solo traveling or backpacking, you usually think of North India, right? So you started off with Rishikesh twice, which is in North
Yeah.
India. So I'm assuming you've also kind of done your fair bit of traveling to South India and like other places in the West and in the East. So how has that experience been
Correct.
like for you?
I think it's honestly super different. I mean, as to how Europeans and people from the West perceive us, India is like a land with multiple countries in itself, and
Correct.
I feel that a lot of times. I mean, coming from North India, I mean, I think a few months back I was traveling with this Australian guy called Eugene back in Kerala, and we were just chilling around in this place called Varkala. I stayed there for like 2 weeks, and what happened was we had to negotiate with the local vendor around some taxi pricing or something. And this guy was like, "Okay, Rish, go ahead and you negotiate on my behalf." And I was like, "Dude, even I don't know the language here." So it's super different from like what I have back in my side of the world in North India. So it's super different. I mean, the way people look at North Indians, I have really not feeling like felt very discriminated or something. But I mean, just the overall vibe is super different. Of course, it's one country, and I mean, in terms of beauty, of course, it's always great, no matter where you end up traveling in India. But in terms of like the cultural differences, so that's a lot of learning for me as well. Not just if I end up going to places like Manali or a Rishikesh or a Varanasi, the culture or the people are still same. But if I were to be somewhere in South India, something like a Kerala or a very remote town in Tamil Nadu, so I think the overall vibe is still very different.
No, that completely makes sense. And in terms of also understanding, there is a stigma not just in India but outside as well, right? When you think about, let's say, foreigners coming to India, there is a stigma that India is not as safe as some of the other countries. So, with your travel
Mhm.
experiences, have you ever felt a sense of like not feeling safe, firstly? Also, like you're a guy, right? So, a lot of the times, like the levels of safety is different for us compared to like, let's say, like a solo female traveler in that situation. But in your
Correct.
experience, you've also met a lot of friends who are female travelers. So have you kind of
Of course.
felt like from their anecdotes or from your own personal experiences that there have been any issues of safety?
So I think to answer your first question, Abhijit, I mean, in terms of how I perceive safety, so I come from Delhi. I've lived for good 7 years in Delhi, and it turns out to be the most unsafe places in the whole world. I was actually robbed in Delhi back in 2019, and I almost got stabbed in Chandni Chowk or something, and that was the time when I took a short break from traveling because I was so scared to even step out of my home. So I come from that place. So if I talk about safety, I don't know, for some reason, wherever I go, apart from Delhi and Jaipur, of course, I mean, that is the place where I come from. So if I am traveling to some remote place in a state like Ladakh, so safety is never a concern for me. It's a bigger concern for me in the place where I come from. And till
Right.
date, I mean, it so happens a lot of times then, I mean, when I'm walking down the street in Delhi or like a Gurugram, so I'm sort of more scared there, like somebody might just come in and rob me. And it's the same for everyone else also. I mean, talking about female, especially people from the West, a lot of my friends who are not from India, and I just met them traveling around super randomly here. So they feel that Delhi is not the best place that they would want to be in, because of course it gets so overwhelmed for them, not just in terms of safety, but of course a lot of 100 people are trying to click a selfie with them,
Right.
ask them for money and whatnot. So taking all of that into account, people actually feel safe. So I mean, safety for me personally, and of course, a couple of other travelers that I've traveled with. So I don't think safety has ever been a concern. And of course, as basic as it sounds, eventually it gets down to how sensible you are. I mean, of course, if you end up doing shitty stuff, if you want to get drunk during one fine night and do rash driving and all sort of things, of course, it gets you in a tricky spot. But
Of
being a
course.
seasoned traveler, it's a lot of onus is on you. You can't just lose out on your mind all the time and be carefree. So yeah, I think that answers.
And in terms of one of the things that has been a common trend with yourself and people I've spoken to as well is the first trip that they usually take, right? Is honestly not one of the best trips that they've taken. So what
Yeah.
prompted you to kind of go for that second and third trip? Because the first trip, like a lot of times, people are going out of their comfort zone to begin with, and if it's not nice, a lot of people take a step back. So for yourself, like after
Correct.
not having the best trip in Rishikesh for your first time, what made you kind of want to
Mhm.
take that second and third trip?
I think I could see the potential. I mean, of course, there were people who were traveling solo. They were friends with a lot of people there. So what intrigued me was like, why am I not able to do this? Of course, I was here to, I mean, be social and I don't know, just introspect is what I would call that process back in time.
Right,
But I wasn't able to do any bit of it. But at the same time, when I went back home, I realized the place was beautiful. I mean, I've never seen Ganga with, I mean, such closeness, and I've never stayed in a dorm room with a bunch of strangers. I could have made out like slightly better of whatever I had. So it was just giving that second shot that, of course, I could not do like what people say when they talk about their first solo trip. So, but let me try again. I mean, of course, it's not going to be so. Second time around, I didn't go with those high expectations, unlike first time. So it's a gradual process. I mean, that's how
right,
I
right,
decode it. So you evolve as a traveler when you just start giving in eventually, and that is when over a period of time you realize that it's not always going to be a high. I mean, till date there are times wherein I end up sitting like a loser in my dorm room, not talking to anyone. But now I've made peace with that process. So for me, there are a lot of high days when you travel, and there are a lot of low days as well, which gets me to the point like why I started Polarturn. So up until October last year, I was working with Bain and Company, right? So I was a consultant, which is when I finally decided to leave my job and travel around the world full time. And it was the same time when I was writing this book, which was called Why I Don't Like to Travel While I Travel. So I've been
right.
someone, personally speaking, who has been super anti social media. the way people glamorize travel on social media platforms, something like an Instagram, is something that I really dislike, because I know I have a lot of travel influencer friends myself, and I know ki unke, like, they're just not as happy as they
Yeah,
look
the
on the
reality
camera.
is very
So I wanted
different
to ask
from
you,
what, yeah.
exactly, exactly. So I wanted to write something super realistic, and this would be my second book. So I just thought that I'll interview a lot of travelers that I meet while traveling around. Uh, so just a bunch of friends now, I call them. So I just spoke to them, very seasoned travelers, people who have been backpacking around for like close to an year or a half or something like that. So I just talked to them and I was like, hey, do you feel low at times when you travel, or is it always a high? And then I started jotting down the reasons, like, okay, this person feels sad because they feel that they're exhausting too much of their money into traveling. Then there are people who are like, we miss our family, and at times you sort of regret because you feel guilty because people are sitting back at home. There are a lot of miseries that you're sort of neglecting, and you're living the life here. So it's a lot of ups and downs in terms of travel. So something that precisely started like pushed me to start Polarturn in the first place.
That's a really good way to think about it. And I was about to jump into the question as to like how you got into Polarturn and how you kind of started that company, but you've already spoken a little bit about it. So tell us a little bit more about what Polarturn actually is and how it's solving that need for the Indian market.
Got it. So let me start with what the problem statement is. I think I'll continue with where I stopped. So after spending close to 3 months in Southeast Asia, I got back to India. I had close to 100 problem statements that I was able to figure out after talking to a lot of travelers. And it comes out there are three major problem statements. If I have to bucket everything into like broad level categories, it's either a people problem, or a budgeting problem, or a planning problem. So to cut you short, I mean, या तो लोग गरीब हैं इंडिया में, या तो आलसी हैं, या तो अकेले, and
Right.
that is why they are not able to travel. So the whole intent was to build a platform that solves for these three problem statements. And Polarturn precisely does that with the, being your digital travel companion. That's the best way I try to, describe my company, elevator pitch as you call it. So I want to build like a digital travel companion that helps you travel more. If you are lonely, if you don't have enough people to travel around with, you come here, you meet a bunch of like-minded people, and you travel with them. That is the first part. Second is planning, wherein the way travel planning is happening right now, it's very scattered. And how I have grown as a traveler is with this one assumption that every person is looking for a different outcome out of their journey. Like, not going too philosophical, but like, whenever, if let's say if Abhijit is traveling to Laos versus if a Rishab is traveling to Laos, both of us would want something different out of our trips. So in
Correct.
order to make that whole planning process super personalized, the way you want to extract your trip, if you don't want to add a bunch of fancy pictures on Instagram, maybe that is not your intent. So what is it that you want to do on your specific trip is something that we solve with Polarturn. And last but not the least, there is a lot of distortion around budgets. Like, how much do you spend? There are people who are talking about budget travel, and then there are people who are staying in fancy resorts in Bali. So how do you actually decode your right budget for whichever place you are going without compromising on like all the great things that people are doing and showing off on Instagram right now? So I think that is what our whole solution is. And we are trying to integrate that with community element along with technology to make it more personalized, using data and using a lot of AI stuff. And if I talk about community, so human, like, traveling nowadays is more about people and not places. So we want to bridge that gap with the community element, wherein whatever information you are reading on the app, or like whatever sources you are checking out on Polarturn, you can validate that with someone who has been there, done that. So that sort of gives you that validation. Okay, if I'm planning to go to a Thailand for a 7 day first solo trip, and a person from my age, my background, has done something similar, if I validate that information with someone, it makes a lot of difference, instead of just going out on random blogs and checking a bunch of reels or a YouTube short videos wherein you don't know that influencer. He
Correct.
or she is probably getting paid to market that particular hostel. But here the whole hypothesis is, not every traveler is a travel influencer. And so to bridge that gap, we want to empower the traveler community a lot more in terms of what they could potentially add on the table. So yeah.
I absolutely love the concept, and that's exactly what I said the first time I spoke with you as well, because personalized travel is something that's very, very important, right? And when you're thinking about personalized
Right.
travel, you usually think about, like, especially in the Indian market as well, you're usually thinking about kind of luxury travel because people are, we can personalize luxury travel because there's money in it, but people aren't necessarily, people aren't necessarily doing a lot when it comes to kind of the budget travel space or doing a lot when it comes to kind of the solo travel space. So I completely see the kind of value you're giving to these kind of travelers and the problem statement that you're kind of going after. In terms of understanding a little bit more about what's happened recently, you mentioned an example of Laos. And, we've spoken about this
Yeah.
in the past as well. And you said you've stayed at the same hostel where these backpackers were
Yeah.
staying, where this unfortunate incident happened because of methanol poisoning at a bar close by. So, what has kind of been your thoughts on the entire event? Because a lot of people, specifically in this area, if you're living in India, your first solo trip is usually places in Southeast Asia. It's not necessarily a place like, let's say,
Correct.
in Europe, because it's not as close. So, what has kind
Yeah.
of been your assumption or like your understanding of how people are reacting to this, firstly, in Indian markets and like in and around this area? And secondly, like what advice do you have for people to just be safe from issues like this in the future?
Yeah. So honestly, I mean, when I heard about this whole incident wherein a couple of foreigners were poisoned with methanol back in Laos, I was super like surprised, more surprised than sad because I personally stayed with Nana backpackers in Wang Viang. I stayed there for like I don't know, close to 5 to 6 days,
Right.
and which was just like about a year ago, and it was one of the most good places that I've ever stayed in, like in terms of the whole welcoming nature of the hosts, the people there, and the overall property. Everything else was great. But the way this incident has happened is, I think, for me, more than the hostel, it was about the fact that it has happened in a place like Laos. So I backpacked around Thailand, Laos, Malaysia, and Indonesia last year during my career break, and Laos was that one place which I was super uncertain of going about because I've honestly never even heard the name of this country up until
Right.
like 2 months before I was actually planning the whole trip. But it turns out Laos ended up being one of the best places that I've ever seen, just because of the fact because people were super welcoming there. I mean, because honestly for me the places, I'm super lazy when it comes to traveling, so I don't end up visiting a lot of waterfalls, this and that, so I majorly just chill around with a bunch of people that I like to hang out with. And Lao was one of such places that I ended up staying for a month, when I had just blocked the slot for not more than 7 days for something as irrelevant as Lao. So when an incident like this happens in Lao, it gets me super sad, honestly, because till date, not a lot of people know about a country like Laos. And when they end up researching now, after this incident, when they end up researching about whether if they should plan for a trip to something like a Wang Viang or a Luang Prabang, they are now not very sure if they would want to go to a place like this, because any which way they have not heard the name of this so-called very minute country that sits in between of Thailand and Vietnam. Of course, everybody goes to Thailand. If an incident like this would happen in something like a Thailand, I would still be, I mean, not very surprised because, of course, Bangkok comes out to be the most visited city in the whole world, and with 20 million tourists coming, clocking around
Right.
every year. I mean, there's just so much happening around. So this was honestly super surprising. Of course, I was not really able to discuss it with the lot of people back in India because till date, a lot of my friends don't know that something like a Lao exists in this world. So, but I had a chance to talk to a lot of co-travelers that I was traveling around with in Laos, and they specifically stayed with me in Nana Backpackers, and it was a shock for them as well. I mean, and I think it was not the hostel. It was
It
some
was a bar
random bar
close
around
by.
the river
Yeah.
Mekong that flows.
Yeah.
Yeah. So not very sure. I mean, if such incidents happen, people like me who are even the most seasoned travelers would end up sort of deciding that they don't have to go for that place, because in general, a place like Lao, what it offers is the genuine connections and the raw vibe. I mean, in a place like Lao, very honestly speaking, I could spot barely three Indians in a stretch of 1 month. So it's that raw till
Right.
date. But if such kind of things happen, and people end up researching about or finding up something like this, it becomes super tricky for a country like Laos to attract more tourists. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, the backpackers crowd that usually flocks from Thailand, as they call it, a banana pancake or something. I mean, there's a term for it, the whole stretch. So it's going to lesser down for some reason, and not very sure what we can do about it in terms of safety. I think all you could do is just probably be more responsible, as I said before. I mean, because you are traveling out there, of course, you meet a lot of great people, you end up making great friends, this and that. But in the end, you're there all by yourself, and there are people waiting for you back at home. So 100% the onus is on you to be responsible. If you're getting too drunk, whatever it is, even if it's not methanol, I mean, I think a lot of it is on you specifically. You don't count on anyone. They're your best friends. Of course, they mean the world to you, whatever the case might be. But still, you got that flight all by yourself, and you have to go back home all by yourself. And of course, your family, your friends are waiting for you back at home. So whatever you are doing in terms of any adventurous, so there were a lot of I mean, accidents in terms of tipsy tubing that happens back in Wang Wang. I don't know if you've heard about it. So it's sort of now legally they're taking some actions to curb that. So it's a very tipsy event wherein people get so drunk and they are riding these tipsy tubes along the river, and a lot of people have actually died. So I chose not to go for that tipsy tubing thing on a very personal level, because sort of not very sure, and I'm like not the best swimmer out there. Of course, I know how to swim, but so because I was not very sure, so I made that choice that okay, getting drunk and going out in a river which is as harsh as Mekong, doesn't really make sense for me to personally do that. And I think one more thing here is there is a lot of internal travel FOMO that I have felt. There is like an external FOMO that okay, people are traveling, I'm not traveling. But when you travel, then also there is a FOMO that okay, people are traveling better than what I'm doing right now. So you should probably get hands on with dealing that FOMO, because that is even a bigger vicious cycle. So you gotta treat yourself better. Don't be so harsh on yourself that okay, if a bunch of people are going for tipsy tubing, or if a bunch of people are getting drunk in some random bar, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, don't do it. If you do feel comfortable swimming after getting drunk on 10 beers, of course, more than happy to have you in that river. But so a lot of it is in you. That's how I perceive this.
No, that completely makes sense. Honestly, I see what you're trying to say, having been a seasoned traveler myself. Like I understand what you mean, because a lot of the times you just have to make judgment calls that are best suited for yourself in situations like these.
Exactly.
Um, so those were all my questions. Now I have a fun segment on this podcast where I'm gonna throw, let's say, a rapid fire round, and then you gotta give me answers as quickly as possible. And this is travel edition. So, are you ready for it?
All right, for sure.
All right. So beaches or
Yeah, I
mountains?
think a good. Sorry,
I
it's
was saying
mountains always.
mountains always. All right. India or outside of India?
India.
Amazing. Indian food or any other food on your travels?
I'm a vegetarian, so it's always an Indian food for me.
All right. Do you like traveling solo or with friends?
Just by myself. It's always a solo trip for me. My
Hostels?
friends would kill me for this, but yeah, it's always a solo.
That's fair, man. I agree with you on that, actually. So hostels or hotels?
Hostels any day.
I like that answer quite a bit. And the last one is Polarturn or Instagram?
I bleed Polarturn, man. I mean, it's a no brainer.
I
It's
know.
it's a no brainer.
It was just a fun question I wanted to put out there to see how quickly you respond to it.
Any fine day Polarturn.
No, that completely makes sense. But thank you so, so much, Rishabh. Like, it was a wonderful time just having a conversation with you, learning more about kind of Indian travel
Likewise.
and this aspect of internal versus versus external FOMO. Like, I felt it myself, but when you said it, it just made it so much more real. Where I started to think a lot of the
Yeah,
time.
it was actually an outcome of the book that I was writing. So back in time, I was not very sure if everybody feels that, but after speaking to so many people, I sort of more comfortable that okay, a lot of them feel an internal FOMO as well, even if they're traveling. So I mean, that's how I made peace with it.
No, that absolutely makes sense, Rishabh. Thank you so, so much again for coming on the Globe and Grind podcast. Everyone, this is episode 6 of the
Likewise.
Globe and Grind podcast. We're very happy that we got Rishabh to talk about his company, Polarturn, give us insights about the Indian travel market, talk to us a little bit more about the book that he was writing, also discuss why he started Polarturn. And I'm very, very excited to see how Polarturn kind of takes shape and goes forward in the future. So thank you so much again, Rishabh, for your time.
Thanks to you, Abhijit. Thanks to Hostelmatch as well. Really looking forward to being an active user for you guys.
Thank you. Thank
So
you.